Hi guys, I hope you're doing well, and in this video we're going to be discussing about the fixed cost, the variable cost, the total cost and the average cost. Now in the previous video we've already seen what is the difference between the explicit and the implicit cost. Now when we talk about the explicit cost, it basically means the cost that is actually paid by the firm. And when we say that those costs that are actually paid by the firm, we can further divide or categorize the explicit cost into further dividing them into fixed and variable cost. Now guys, before I move on to what fixed cost is, you need to understand that a firm's cost of production, right? A firm's cost of production depends upon the inputs or the factors of production it is using. The more inputs it uses, the more factors of production it uses, obviously the higher should be the cost, right? We can further say that the cost is basically dependent not only on the price of the factors of production, that is obviously the price of the factor of production, meaning the factor prices, that is the, like we know that the factor price for land is rent, and the factor price for capital is interest, and the factor price for labor is wages, right? So obviously that represents a cost to the firms, right? The rent, the interest, the wages, right? So the more the factor prices, the higher would be the cost, and the lower the factor prices, the lower would be the cost. But it also depends upon the productivity of the factors of production, because the productivity of the factors of production would actually determine the quantity of the factors of production the business has to use. Because the more productive the factors of production are, right, the lesser would be the quantity required. Now we know obviously the cost would depend upon the price of the factors times the quantity of the factors. So the price of the factors of production times the quantity of the factors of production that the business is using. So the higher the price of the factors, the more the cost would be. And similarly, the more the quantity of the factors of production it uses, the more the cost would be. But then remember that if the factors of production are more productive, that is, they're more efficient, they're more, there's more specialization taking place, there's more increasing returns, and the more productive the factors are, the lesser their quantity would be required. So if factors of production are more productive, the lesser their quantity is required, and the lesser would be the cost. So it depends. So the total cost for any business would depend upon the price of those factors as well as the quantity of those factors. And the quantity of the factors would obviously be dependent on the productivity of the factors. The less efficient the factors are, the more inputs or the factors would be needed to produce a given quantity of output, and hence the more would be the overall cost for the business. Now guys, moving on to what fixed costs are. Like I said, the explicit costs are divided into further fixed cost and variable cost, because when you say that the costs that are being paid are explicit costs, so the nature of the cost is such that some of the explicit costs are fixed in nature while some of the explicit costs are variable in nature. Now what are fixed costs, guys? Fixed costs are simply those costs that do not vary with output. They do not change with output, which means that if your output is zero, you don't produce anything, you still have to pay that cost even if you do not produce anything. Or whether you produce 1 unit, 10 units, 100 units, or billions or millions of units, you still incur that cost, and the cost is the same. So for example, the example of such cost could be the interest on the loan, or rent of the property, or the rent of the factory, right? So for example, if I have a factory and I pay $100 in rent, so if let's suppose I do not produce anything and I just shut the doors and I go on a vacation, so even if I'm going on a vacation, I'm not producing anything in the factory, 0 units are produced, still I have to pay the rent, right? So the fixed costs will not change with output, they will stay the same. So even at an output level of 0 units, fixed costs will be incurred. Even at an output level of, if I produce 10 units, 20 or hundreds of units, still the fixed cost of $100 will have to be paid. They are fixed, they do not vary with output. If output rises, they stay the same. If output falls, they stay the same. Even if there's no output, still they have to be paid. Now guys, moving on to the variable cost. What are variable costs? These are known as variable because they vary with output, which means that if the quantity of the output is rising, the variable cost will rise. If the quantity of the output is falling, the variable cost will fall. They are directly proportional to the quantity of the output. So if you're producing 0 units, the variable cost would also be $0, which means you won't incur any cost. If you produce 1 unit, the variable cost will rise. If you produce 2 units, the variable cost will rise further. So the higher the quantity, the higher the variable cost, the lower the quantity of the output, the lower would be the variable cost, right? That's the nature of the variable cost. So the variable cost rises as more and more units are produced. It falls as less units are produced. Examples could be the raw material cost, the inputs required, the varying inputs required, such as the raw materials. The raw material cost is a variable cost. The wage cost is a variable cost, right? Because obviously the more output you produce, the more labor you require. The more labor you require, the more would be your wage cost. Hence, it is variable. The more output you produce, the more raw materials you require. Hence, higher would be your variable cost. And guys, what is total cost? Total cost is basically the total cost that is incurred in producing one unit or producing the units that you're producing. And it's basically the sum of your variable cost and fixed cost. So total cost is just fixed cost plus your variable cost. So for example, if I want to calculate the total cost of producing, let's say 3 units. So, let's say the fixed cost is $10, which is fixed irrespective of the number of units, and the variable cost of these 3 units is, let's suppose, maybe $40, right? So the total cost would be $10 plus $40, which is $50. So basically, it's just the sum of your variable and your fixed cost. That is the total cost of producing a certain given quantity of output. Now, guys, moving on to what average fixed cost is. Basically, when you talk about average fixed cost, you're talking about per unit cost. Whenever you hear the word average, you're talking about per unit, right? So average fixed cost would mean per unit, how much fixed cost is actually absorbed in one single unit of output. So the formula is total fixed cost divided by the output. That is average fixed cost. So it's simply, so for example, if we know that, let's say, if I'm producing, let's say I'm taking units here and I'm taking fixed cost here. If I produce, 1 unit, so the fixed cost is $10. If I produce 2 units, the fixed cost is still $10. If I produce 3 units, the fixed cost is still $10, right? So the average fixed cost would be total fixed cost over output. So 10 over 1 would be, $10. 10 over 2 would be $5. 10 over 3 would be something 3 point something something, right? So we see that the average fixed cost, sorry, we see that the average fixed cost is constantly falling as you increase your output. So as your output goes up, which means your quantity of output increases, your average fixed cost falls. And the simple reason is, since the numerator, that is the total fixed cost, would stay constant over a range of output, if you divide this constant value by a denominator that is constantly increasing, obviously the mathematical value would fall. So the simple reason is that average fixed cost falls because the fixed cost is spread over a larger volume of output or a larger quantity or volume of output. So basically, as you increase your units, your fixed cost is spread over, the same fixed cost is, spread over higher volume and units of output, and that is why your average fixed cost decline. Since the numerator is constant, it's being divided over by a denominator with constantly increasing value. Moving on to what average variable cost is, guys. Average variable cost is simply variable cost per unit of output. That is how much variable cost is absorbed in a single unit. So the formula is total variable cost divided by the output. So let's suppose if you produce 1 unit, your variable cost is maybe, let's say, $20. If you produce 2 units, let's say your variable cost is $30. So the average variable cost would be 20 over 1, that is 20, and then 30 over 2, that is $15. So you see that the average variable cost is falling. But guys, I'm going to be, in the coming videos, I'm going to be discussing the nature of the average variable cost. It's not that the average variable cost will constantly fall as you increase the number of units. Just like average. So basically, if you talk about average fixed cost, the average fixed cost will fall. That's the nature of the average fixed cost. It will fall as you increase the number of units. The average fixed cost would start falling, and it would just keep on falling as more and more units are produced. However, this is not the case with the average variable cost. The average variable cost will initially fall, but then it will start rising, after diminishing marginal return sets in. But that's not what I'm going to be discussing in this video. We're going to be discussing that in the later videos. However, the way to calculate average variable cost is simply total variable cost divided by output. That's it. Moving forward, guys, what is average cost? Average cost, also known as average total cost. Basically, what we're doing is we are taking total cost and we are dividing that by the output. So we are just checking that how much total cost is absorbed in a single unit. So it's total cost per unit of output. That is how much how much total cost is absorbed in a unit, right? How much does one single unit cost us in total, right? So the formula is total cost divided by output. So if you take units here, you take fixed cost, you take variable cost, you take total cost here. So if you're producing 1 unit, the fixed cost is $10. Let's say the variable cost is $20. The total cost is $30. So the average cost would be how much? The average cost would be 30 divided by 1, which is 30. And let's suppose you produce 2 units, the fixed cost would still be 10. Let's say the variable cost is, I don't know, somewhere 25. So 25 plus 10 would be how much? 35. And then your average cost, let's say, should be 35 divided by 2, and that should be somewhere around, I think, 17.5, if I'm not wrong. right? So you see that the average cost is falling. So as you produce more, the average cost falls. But again, then let me tell you that it's not that as you just keep on increasing the number of units, the average cost would start falling. The average cost, yes, definitely it would initially fall, but then after diminishing marginal return sets in, the average cost would rise. So the shape of the average cost would be somewhat like this. But then again, this is not the I'm not going to be explaining this in this video. We're going to be discussing all this, why, how does the shape of the average cost is, and how the shape of average variable and fixed cost are in the coming videos. But there's another method of calculating the average cost, and that is average cost is basically average fixed cost plus average variable cost. So average cost is the sum of average fixed cost plus average variable cost, and this is actually just the same, because the formula for average cost is total cost divided by output, right? And total cost is basically fixed cost plus variable cost. So basically what you're doing is that you're dividing fixed cost by variable cost over output. So I could, if I divide, so there's another way of writing this formula, is I could say fixed cost over output plus variable cost over output, right? So this gives me average fixed cost plus this gives me average variable cost. So if I add them up, it equals to average cost, which is just the same formula as this one, right? So this is how you calculate average cost. You divide total cost by the number of units you're producing. It gives you the cost per unit. Okay, now moving on to one another important cost, right? And this is one of the very important costs, because we're going to be discussing that in the coming videos as well. That is the marginal cost. Now guys, remember that marginal means extra. We know that we have already seen before as well when we discuss marginal product. Marginal means extra. So when we are talking the marginal cost, we are talking about the extra cost. Now the extra cost that a business incurs, guys, what is marginal cost? It is the extra cost, right? The extra cost that the business incurs when we produce one more unit of output. So if the business produces another unit of output, what is the extra cost that the business has incurred because of producing that additional unit of output? The formula for calculating marginal cost is change in total cost divided by change in quantity. Now I'm going to be giving a numerical example for this. So for example, I've drawn a table here. Let's suppose you're producing 0 units. Now at 0 units, your total cost is $10. Wait, hang on a second. Why $10? When you're not producing anything, then why are you incurring a cost even? So guys, remember I told you that if you're producing 0 units, you will still be incurring a fixed cost. So remember that at 0 units, your total cost is always equal to your fixed cost, because even if you're not producing anything, you would still be incurring a fixed cost. We've already discussed that as well. So guys, at 0 units, your total cost is always equal to your fixed cost. If you produce the first unit, let's say your fixed cost is still $10, which obviously fixed cost is the same, right? It doesn't change, it doesn't vary with output. So the variable cost is $5 and the total cost is $15, because it's 10 plus 5. So the marginal cost, if you talk about the marginal cost, like I said, is the extra cost of producing an additional unit. So if you produce an extra one unit, you incur an extra total cost of $5, because the formula for calculating marginal cost is change in total cost divided by change in output. So how did I come up with the value 5? What I did was that I deducted 15, I did 15 minus 10 divided by, that is the change in total cost, divided by the change in the number of units, that is 1 minus 0. So the answer is simply 5, right? That's simply how I'm calculating marginal cost. If I produce 2 units, the fixed cost is 10, the variable cost rises from 5 to 8, total cost is 18. Again, it's simple. How will I calculate the marginal cost? I'll deduct 18 minus 15 divided by 2 minus 1, and the answer should be 3. So it means that when I produce 2 units, so the extra cost that the business has incurred when it produces an additional unit, that is the second unit. So because of producing the second unit, I'm going to repeat this because you need to be very clear on this. Because of producing the second unit, the business incurred an additional cost of $3. Now, because of producing the third unit, the business incurred an additional cost of $2. How did I come up with $2? The fixed cost is 10. The variable cost, let's suppose, rises from 8 to 10, and that is the total cost rises to then 18 to 20. And so the difference is 20 minus 18 divided by 3 minus 2, which should come to $2. Right? It's 20 minus 18 upon 3 minus 2, it comes to $2. So we see that the marginal cost is basically going down. But again, that's not what I wanted to explain it to you in this video. But guys, one more thing that I wanted to explain it to you was, so if you just look at the definition of what marginal cost is simply the extra cost of when we produce one more unit. Now we know for the fact that fixed cost is the same. Fixed cost will not change. So if a business produces an additional unit, it won't incur any additional or extra fixed cost, because because if you produce one more unit, you won't be incurring any extra fixed cost. Although yes, you will be incurring an extra variable cost, but you won't incur an extra fixed cost if you produce an additional unit, right? Because fixed cost stays the same always, right? So technically what's happening is that the marginal cost is equal to the variable cost, because what's happening here is that the extra cost that the business will incur will be the variable cost. So that is why we say that all marginal costs are variable, since there can be no extra fixed cost as output rises. So basically, another way of writing, so the marginal cost formula can also be written as, instead of saying change in total cost, because the fixed cost will not change, right? The fixed cost will not change. So what will change is the variable cost. So I could say it is the change in variable cost divided by the change in quantity. And you see the answer would be the same. Because what you see here is, when you produce one unit, right? So let's suppose when the number of units goes from, let's say, 1 to 2, you produce an extra unit, right? So the variable cost on producing the one unit was $5. The variable cost on basically producing 2 units in total is $8. So the extra variable cost that you have incurred is basically $3. So the extra variable cost that you have incurred on producing an additional unit, that is the second unit, is basically how much. So the additional unit, that is the second unit, was the additional unit, has contributed to has basically resulted into an extra $3 cost being incurred for the business, which is the marginal cost, right? And this marginal cost has been incurred because the business has basically produced an additional unit. And this extra additional cost, $3 cost, is the marginal cost, which is simply the extra variable cost which is basically simply the extra variable cost that the business has incurred, right? And similarly, you can see that so when the business produces 3 units, so the extra cost that the business incurred when it produces the third unit results into an extra $2 cost being incurred, right? So these extra $2 costs are basically the extra $2 worth of variable cost that the business has actually incurred, right? So that is why we say that the marginal cost is basically, when we say that, marginal cost is the extra cost that the business is incurring when you're producing another unit of output. So the extra cost would be the variable cost, right? It would be the extra variable cost, basically. That is why we say that a formula could also be written as change in variable cost over change in quantity. So that's it, guys. That you need to know what marginal cost is. Marginal cost is simply the extra cost when the business produces one more unit of output. So whenever you're producing an additional unit, whenever you're producing one more unit, whatever the extra cost that the business incurs is basically the marginal cost, which is obviously variable in nature. And guys, again, the nature of the marginal cost is that the marginal cost initially falls. After a certain point it rises, because once diminishing return sets in, the marginal cost would start rising, and before that the marginal cost would be falling. But again, we will be discussing that in the later videos, but which will be a very important video, because the graphs of the the marginal cost, the average variable cost, all these graphs are basically taking whatever the shape these graphs have of marginal, average, and average variable cost. They result from the law of diminishing marginal returns. The law of diminishing marginal returns actually determines the shape of these curves. Okay, guys? So that's it for this video, guys. I'm going to be ending here. I hope you enjoyed the video and understood it as well. I'm going to be seeing you all around in the next video. Until then, take care.